Hi, everyone. This is Keith from Last Call Bar Academy, and I'm here with a few students who are at various stages of their LSAT prep, but mostly toward the beginning. One student is just starting and hasn't done anything at all. And then we have another student who is feeling relatively prepared, but is having some time management problems. And so I'm going to discuss triple review, the study method that I developed with Jacob Feldman, and why I think it is the right way to study and why it's effective. And then if you all would like to ask some questions about how to implement triple review into your studies, I'll be happy to follow up. All right, I'm going to share the slides. Here is my presentation on triple review. One of the questions, probably the most common question that I get from students is this completely frazzled, what in the world am I supposed to do? Help. And this is where I'm most sympathetic with the students, because if you just Google search LSAT book, LSAT strategy, LSAT product, the market is overwhelming. There's dozens of LSAT products and strategies and courses, tutors. The options are endless. I describe it as a financial black hole. But I think one of the mistakes that students make is trying to consume everything, or at least trying to consume too much. I describe it as the too many cooks in the kitchen problem. And I know this is happening when I'm working with a student doing private tutoring, and they start saying certain artificial things to me that I know they didn't make up. Isn't that a necessary condition? Correlation doesn't equal causation, or some kind of stock phrase. And then I know, oh, you're reading some book that I don't like, and that's what's stalling us in the process. So what are the resources that you do need? I think the one indispensable thing is a plentiful supply of practice tests. At this point, I don't think you should be prepping for the LSAT without a LawHub subscription, because even if you can get hard copies of the exams, that doesn't teach you to use the digital interface. And the LSAT is a digital exam at this point, not just because of the pandemic. They had already gone to a digital format prior to the pandemic and prior to the flex version of the exam. So they were sort of prepared for the pandemic, but maybe not completely prepared. But at any rate, LawHub is the official uh, platform for the exam. And there's 70 plus official practice tests on LawHub for $99. I think that the value is obvious, and that everyone should just get LawHub right off the bat and renew your subscription after a year if you continue prepping into year two. The other thing that I advocate, and Ashton can uh, can verify this, is that I tell everyone you need to have a really good English dictionary, not dictionary.com, something like Merriam-Webster or Oxford, something that has multiple definitions for each word and will give you connotations and etymology and some background. Because in order to be good at the LSAT, you have to be an expert in formal English. That's foreign to even most English speakers. Most English speakers learn a colloquial form of English that is not as formal as the LSAT. And so you have to train yourself to reinterpret or reimagine your vocabulary using a proper dictionary. The third thing, and here's where it gets most challenging, and to go back to point two briefly, as a veteran LSAT tutor of 20 years, I still find myself using a dictionary on a daily basis when I'm studying the LSAT. So I think that it is unlikely that typically a person has the kind of vocabulary that would enable them to eschew that kind of resource. I'm often surprised, and Ashton has joined the club on this, that when we look up words that we think we know, sometimes it turns out we don't know them as well as we thought we did, because we're relying on that colloquial meaning that I was describing before. And the LSAT is trading on a more technical definition that perhaps we weren't aware of or weren't quite appreciating. Okay, on to bullet point three, the trusted guide. Here's where your options are so numerous that it becomes difficult to choose. in addition to the practice tests and in addition to the dictionary, you need for someone who's knowledgeable about the LSAT to say, here's the kind of exercises you should do, and here's when. Here's a study plan. Here's a resource that's good. You know, you need some kind of push in the right direction. And so I've listed these in what I think is the proper order of their benefit. The best ones at the top and the worst ones at the bottom. Or maybe I'll have to rethink it. A sort of giving a little jab here. The LSAT tutors are pretty close to the bottom. That wasn't intentional, but okay, here's what I mean. First of all, I think that if you can find someone who's knowledgeable about the LSAT and who is also steeped in legal education, law school, academia, that I think will be your best guide, because that kind of person can see the bigger picture, help you achieve a good LSAT score, but not at the expense of learning the proper skills for law school. In fact, a good legal educator will actually, you know, serve as a complement uh, to your enrollment and transition into law school. But a legal educator is cost prohibitive for a vast majority of applicants. So if you can't get personal attention from a law school professor or a former admissions personnel, your next best thing are these subscription services, which I think are super clever products that have quickly risen to the top of the market. Seven Sage and LSAT Demon have outclassed the other materials, not because their strategies are better, but because their pricing scheme is better. You can consume these on a monthly basis, cancel your subscription if things come up, or if you want to try a new resource, you can go back and resubscribe if it turns out that it was a good resource and you didn't appreciate the value of it. So I'm pretty high on using the subscription services early on, particularly if you're on a budget and you can't get the legal educator in your corner. Next, I list the PowerScore Bibles, which I think are a tremendous resource if you use them the right way, and a horrible resource if you use them the wrong way. And so it's kind of fitting that they're sort of in the middle of the pack there. But ultimately, I bumped them up closer to the top because of my opinion that they can be used in a very meaningful and valuable way. And if they are, they're actually the industry standard. Nothing beats the PowerScore Bibles if you're using them in this very targeted way. If you're a little less certain about how to use the books, then I think the Manhattan Prep books serve your needs a little better because they aren't quite so detailed. They won't take you down a bunch of rabbit trails. They'll keep you focused on the main strategies, and they have a good guide for each of the three sections of the exam. And if you're looking for something targeted, Ellen Cassidy's book, The Loophole in LSAT Logical Reasoning, is extremely good. And it's good because it focuses on grammar and not test gimmicks. Or rather, I should say, the parts of the book that focus on syntax and grammar are good. The parts of The Loophole that focus on test gimmicks, i.e., the later half of the book, I don't endorse as heavily. But she's on the right track in terms of telling students that you have to be good at English grammar and English syntax ultimately to be good at the LSAT. And that's also why I respect the LSAT trainer, which I don't have listed here. But for beginners, that is an excellent resource. In fact, for someone who is fresh out of the gate, Annie, I'm thinking about you. You've done nothing at all and truly don't have a grasp on where to begin. There's a book called The LSAT Trainer that I think is very foundational and takes the right approach in terms of teaching you to interpret grammar and not trying to teach you tricks and lists of indicator words, which I'm very skeptical of. So I should have put that on the list, but I was unsure where to put it. For someone right at the tip of the process, the trainer is an excellent resource. But if you're familiar with the LSAT at all, it's likely that you've surpassed the utility of the LSAT trainer. Maybe that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but if you've done any significant amount of studying, you're certainly beyond the contents of the trainer. All right, the other resource that I talk about frequently are online explanations. You could Google search pretty much any official LSAT question and get an explanation of, better or worse quality. Sometimes several explanations for some questions from different companies that are offering free explanations as a carrot to come look at their products. The online explanations, I'll put that on the realm of the the PowerScore Bibles. If you use those explanations appropriately, they can be extremely helpful. And I would be lying if I said that I never look up Dave Hall's explanation, or I'm never interested in PowerScore's discussion on a question. I'm often interested in those, but I'm interested in those as a supplement to my own interpretation, not a substitute for it. I'm not asking them to tell me how to read the question. I'm asking them to confirm or deny my reading of the question, and then I'll go back to the books and continue thinking from there. So I'll get into that a little bit more in a second, but the online explanations, I think if used in the wrong way, can be a crutch that severely impedes your progress. If you're using those as a substitute for being able to find the answers on your own, or explain the weaknesses of the wrong answers or the strengths of the right answers, then um, then that will cripple your process. At some point, you have to take the reins and start to provide or attempt those explanations on your own. It would be kind of like learning a language but never speaking it, constantly just looking at what other people say. You would get better at it, but you wouldn't get as good as if you would be willing to make mistakes and start speaking the language, even improperly at first, and then gradually work to a point where you could speak it better. In addition to these resources, there are, dozens, hundreds of LSAT tutors out on the market. I think they can be helpful, but the quality of LSAT tutors, and I distinguish these from legal educators, these are people who are good at the LSAT, but do not understand the process of legal education. So sometimes they may not have been to law school themselves. Other times they might be law school graduates or practicing attorneys who went to law school but didn't participate in academia as teachers. And so that's why I've distinguished that from the legal educator who might be more inclined to think a bigger picture. But what I would put at the bottom of the resource list are the big box classes. And so if any of you are thinking about buying $1,000 class or a $1,500 class from one of the large outfits, I would say hard pass on that. Whatever other resources you can think of, I would put them somewhere above big box classes, and then we could debate where they fall in terms of the other resources. But there's very few things that I think are less efficient or more expensive than those large company courses. All right, so I'm going to move on to a new topic, but I want to pause to see if anyone has questions about anything that I've just said, or if you want me to go in a particular direction today.
I have a question.
Sure. Tell me how to pronounce your name.
It's Patralee.
Patralee, thank you for coming.
Thank you. I guess my question is, and I guess maybe I won't know this until I actually start diving into the material, but I'm kind of curious as to how you combine these resources, because let's say you do a video course. Like, I'm just curious as to do you the 7 stage and the LSAT demon, is that something that you can use along with whatever your main resource is? The loophole, that particular one, is that something that that you also use concurrently with other resources? Or because I hear a lot of people say stick with one particular set of materials, and so I'm just kind of curious as, do these all sort of complement each other, or is that something like I said, I wouldn't know until I kind of start studying?
That's a hard question. Every author, every tutor, every teacher in this space has a particular perspective on the LSAT. And you wouldn't get to the point, you wouldn't keep doing this work if there weren't some affirmation of your model. Some students have to do well with it for you to say, hey, I like this, I'm going to write a book and sell it. So in one sense, everything on the market is good. It all has something valuable to say. But then
Right.
your other question was, does it complement, the other materials? There's where you run into problems, because nobody wants to connect their system to another. They all want their
Right, right,
system to be the independent one.
right,
So they don't play well together. And
right.
what I think is really the problem with the systems on the market today is that they were designed to defeat the LSAT. They're too good for their own good. In other words, they're so good at describing the test that they've totally missed the point, which is that what we should be learning is the skills of
Skills.
deductive reasoning, reading comprehension, right?
Mhm.
And so I try to take an approach where I ditch all the resources, and I'll get into that a little bit more, how to use them. The reason why I mentioned Seven Sage and LSAT Demon as high quality resources, that has to do with their reputation on the market. I don't personally like them. I wouldn't use them, but
Okay.
they are so well respected and so many people get high scores using those that it would be totally disingenuous for me to say those are bad resources.
Right.
They're not. They are cleverly marketed and priced resources. But if you ask me how I would organize a study regime, it would be based on this triple review method that I developed. And then I would tap into those other resources as necessary. So let me
Okay.
describe triple review, and that I think will answer some of your questions, Patrially, about how to incorporate the other resources.
Okay,
It,
thank you.
sure. And Afton has asked in the comments whether to use the trainer before the PowerScore Bibles. And I would say that if you are just starting out, or if your diagnostic score is, maybe below 150, then yes, I think the trainer is a good foundational book that is advisable before the Bibles. But if, I mentioned before, if you've already been studying for a while and you have the foundations of the LSAT, at that point, I don't know that the trainer has a lot to offer. And so I might look for other resources. The study method that I've invented over many, many years is triple review. And so I want to talk about that. And I have several slides to help you guys think about why I think this is the best study method. And then we can try to think about how to integrate my study method with the other resources, because I don't have, the triple review book that would answer all your questions. We still have to look for other resources to answer certain things. Well, so here's why I think this is the best study method. As I was just discussing with Patrially, the LSAT is a skill-based test, not a memorization kind of exam. And so that's the real problem with looking to strategy guides like the PowerScore Bibles for a test like the LSAT. You can know everything in the world, but the test is about whether you can do something particular in a timed circumstance, not whether you just know the answer in some abstract sense. The study method that I developed is based on the psychology of learning. And I mean that in all earnestness, that I read articles on the psychology of learning. I follow all kinds of forums and groups for teachers and educators and people who are interested in neuroscience. So I do a lot of thinking about not just how to be a good teacher, but what should my students be doing to be good students? And if they use my study method, the things that they gain from it are, first of all, it's based on spaced repetition. I mean, the name gives it away, right? It's triple review. You're going through each thing 3 times, because what we learn from the studies in psychology is that once you encounter something new, you immediately start to forget it. And it's only the reinforcement of repetition that allows you to commit it to long-term memory, so that then you can use that model to answer future questions. Typically, a single exposure to a question or a problem isn't enough to really learn it. So that's point one. My system is based on this psychology. It's also based on anxiety management, which I think is one of the problems that was being described earlier by, I think it was KY, but he's jumped off. But at any rate, The problem is that if people don't do enough time testing, then the timing itself becomes a source of anxiety. And so triple review is a method that reduces or accounts for anxiety management. And then finally, triple review is a method that encourages active learning over passive learning. Reading a strategy guide is passive. You're asking someone else, how should I take the test? You tell me, expert, teach me something. Triple review is more about you grappling with the test itself and saying, I'm going to figure this out. And if I have trouble, I may engage with the teacher, but I'm not going to rely on the teacher to spoon feed me the information. That's the gist of triple review. The other real benefit of triple review is that scheduling becomes really simple. There's 3 steps for every practice test. You do it timed, you do a blind review, and then you do a strategy planning step, what I call the mind step. So you map out however many prep tests you intend to take and schedule an appropriate number of hours, 3 reviews for each section of each test, 1 timed, 1 blind, 1 mind. And I'll go more into what each one accomplishes and what to do during each step on my next slide. But I'll pause again to take questions if you guys want to ask anything. All right, well, let's push on then. Why did I develop triple review? People are skeptical sometimes when I push this because they think this is another thing I have to learn. And I was just chatting with Patrally about how all these systems don't play well together. And now I'm telling you, here's another system, but does it play well with the other systems is really the real question. So the reason why I developed triple review is that my tutoring rate got really high. And at some point I wanted more efficiency with my students. I wanted our meetings to accomplish more, and I wanted them to do more in between the meetings so that we could be more savvy about how to use their budget when they were working with me. They were just spending too much to work with me, so I developed a better review regimen, a way that they could teach themselves between tutoring sessions. I wanted to also, I developed this for students who are self-studying, but spinning their wheels with a lot of different cooks in the kitchen. They're wasting time. I want them to stop grappling with those strategy guides and really start focusing on the exam and the skills that need to be improved. The other reason that I developed this, reducing test anxiety. I want people to be doing timed tests early and often so that by the time they sit for the LSAT, there is no transition. It's part of their study regimen. It's just something they do on a regular basis. I take time tests once a week or once every other week for 12 weeks leading up to the LSAT, not I'll do it once I know enough to do a time test. I promise you this, even after 20 years of taking the LSAT, I never feel great about time tests. I never do a time section and think, wow, that was fun. I knew them all and there was no difficulty. I don't feel tired. And certainly once I stack several in a row, the amount of mental fatigue becomes frustrating. There will never be a point where you've read enough of the PowerScore Bibles to think, I can't wait to do this timed LSAT. So don't wait for that to happen. That's the big illusion that people are under. I'm going to feel good about this someday. I'll feel good enough to where the time tests are no longer intimidating. They intimidate the heck out of me. I do a series of courses, which I'll pitch to you guys, by the way, starting in a couple weeks. Jacob Feldman and I are teaching a class that covers the May 2020 Flex exam, and I'll drop a link in the comments later in the session if you guys want to sign up for that. But why was I talking about those? Oh, when I prepare for class and I do a time section, I don't feel great about it. And I feel even worse when I've missed a question or two and I'm supposed to be the expert teaching that class that evening. And so going back and unpacking and learning from those questions that I miss, it's a process that I really have to embrace, or else I would have to stop doing this work because the LSAT is hard. It's hard for everybody. The other reason why I developed triple review is that I think using the test prep gimmicks that are on the market, you can actually get yourself up to a good score. You can heuristic your way to a 160, maybe even a 170. But I don't think that that's terrific preparation for law school, because your law school exams are not multiple choice. And ultimately, you're going to have to be able to express yourself verbally in English when it comes to the strengths and weaknesses of argumentation. And so I really enjoy triple review because it forces yourself to document your reasoning and to put things into words rather than to simply select answers and then pat yourself on the back when you get lucky. Oh, Ashton in the comments is talking about taking exams with distractions. I like to take exams. I shouldn't say I like to. Now in the pandemic, it's a different environment. I used to like to take them at Starbucks, precisely because it was the worst environment. And on top of the talking, which I can usually tune out unless it's one individual very close to me, but if it's just kind of background chatter, I can tune it out. But what really bugs me about Starbucks is that machine with all the foam, whatever it is, it's very, very loud. And I don't drink that particular kind of coffee that needs that machine. So every time it starts, churning up, I can't stand it. But that's the environment that I learned to train in. I decided I was going to train in the most distracting environment possible, and that I would, the real test would be an alleviation from that that scenario, not an added aggravation to my typical scenario. So that's a great idea, Ashton, to induce some distractions while you're taking practice tests so that you can prepare for the inevitable distractions that will exist.
Well, it actually worked against me because, like you said, you were taking these time tests at Starbucks. So
Yeah.
I was taking it at Starbucks and at Cafe Brazil, and there was this background noise. And I thought, okay, I'm doing a worst case scenario. Well, I came to find out that background noise for me was very comforting. It was relaxed. It didn't feel like a test or anything. And so I was able to focus in on the questions and do real well. And then on test day, that first time that I took the test in November, uh, I get into the test and all of a sudden, because I don't have that background noise, now I can hear the little sounds of like the air conditioner, which starts creating anxiety for me, or people mowing outside, or just, I don't know, the silence to me created anxiety. And so whenever I prepared for the February exam, I decided everything that I could possibly simulate on the conditions for test day. And of course, I had PTSD too, so things are a little different for me. My brain works weird, but in order to reduce my anxiety, anytime I did the first step of the triple review, I tried to make sure the room was set up the same way, that I was using the same Law Hub software, that I was doing the exact time, and then the 4 pieces of paper, everything was set up the same. And that way, when February came along, it was just like another practice test. There was no difference from the regular practice test for me. But that's what worked for me. I know everybody's so different, and my brain is so weird that what works for me is not necessarily going to work for everyone else.
What you're illustrating, though, is really what I developed triple review to do. I learned after teaching for decades that there were so many different scenarios and issues that my students had that I couldn't anticipate them all. And furthermore, I couldn't assume that my issues would be the same as their issues. And so triple review is all about introspection. It's all about you figuring out what are the mental blocks. And that way, if you do engage with a tutor or a legal educator, you can be more pointed in your discussions. The discussions can be more deliberate. Here's what I've isolated as a difficulty, and then we brainstorm together how to accommodate that difficulty. So I think that's really brilliant, Ashton. All right, Subrata has raised her hand, so I'm gonna let her jump in for a question before we start talking about steps 1 and 2 of triple review. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for this.
Sure.
So I've been putting off the diagnostics, to be honest with you, but I need to do it tomorrow. So one thing that I've noticed with the logical reasoning questions is like when I'm looking at them, sometimes I like my brain just, I don't know what it does. But then if somebody else is reading them out to me, I'm like, oh, this is the correct answer. And then last time my husband did that for me, he just read out the questions and also like the options. And I think I did like 20 questions and I got them all right. But when I'm doing the same thing, I get them wrong. Does it make sense? I feel like I second guess myself too much, or, I just get lost in something. And I'm like, is this just me or does this happen to everybody? So, and
You
is
know,
there anything around it?
I find that our university education tends to train us to read too quickly. And so I'm wondering if verbalizing the ideas isn't just forcing you to slow down a little bit and think about them more critically or more accurately, more concretely. Because here's an experience that I have with many students when I do LR questions. Typically, they get so far ahead of me that if I try to listen to what they're saying,
Mhm.
they tie me up in knots and I am confused. What I have to do if I'm looking at a brand new question with a student, what I have to do is after reading the question and the argument, I have to literally tune them out entirely. I mean, I do this deliberately. It seems rude, but I explain to them what I'm doing because I have to organize the argument before I can start talking about it, before I can start reading the answer choices, before I can do anything at all. I spend 15 or 20 seconds rereading key points, checking points of comparison, thinking about the strengths of the logic. I mean, there's a whole interpretation process that I think most people aren't even doing. And then the remarkable thing about it is that by the time I snap back to attention and get back to what they're doing, reading the answers or whatever, I fly past them. I'm so far ahead of them. And so it's really ironic that they get ahead of me at step one or step two. But I finish the question typically a good 20 or 30 seconds before they do. And I've got the answer right, and they're still waffling between two. Maybe sometimes they've even eliminated the right answer. So the thing that I've learned about LR is that you go slow to go fast. If you don't take your time to establish the framework and organize your thoughts, the answer choices will chew you up and spit you out. They're not there to help you. And, evaluating the answer choices has to be done after you've gained clarity on the problem, not before. You can't use the answer choices to figure out the hardest questions. You can on the easiest ones. That's why people are drawn to that approach. On the SAT, if you don't know, if you can't articulate the answer, maybe can't is the wrong word. You don't have to articulate the answer because you can just reverse engineer it from the correct answer choice and then eliminate the wrong ones. But on the hardest LSAT questions, you can't do that, or you can't do that quickly. And so being able to pause, reflect, organize, and predict the answer becomes a really crucial skill. That's what I was talking about on the last slide when I said that developing verbal skills that translate well to law school is part of my aim with triple review. So let me talk about that in connection with triple review. I'll give you some tips on how to get better at organizing your thoughts on LR to start making some improvements there. When I teach triple review, I tell students you want to do each section 3 times. As they get closer to the official test, eventually it becomes an entire time test, not just an individual section. But at any rate, the first step is always the same. It's timed. And I want my students to use whatever their official time limit is with their accommodations. With no accommodations, it's 35 minutes. If you have some extended time, go ahead and utilize it. For the time test, I want my students to use LawHub to simulate the real test. And I want them to make sure that they're implementing their action plan. This is crucial. I know I haven't discussed the action plan yet. The action plan is the product of step 3 of triple review. And so when you go to the next time section or the next time test, from the previous timed one or from the previous 3-round review, you should have this action plan, the things that you intend to do differently on the next one. Implementing that on your next timed approach, that's crucial to making progress and not just making the same mistakes over and over again. When the time expires on your timed section, what I want my students to do is get a sheet of paper and document their answers, because I don't want them to see the correct answers yet. This is really crucial. And so while they're documenting their correct answers, you know, the time runs out and then everything just freezes if you're in the self-paced mode. You don't want to be in the test mode. That's different. Self-paced mode, everything just freezes, and you can go back and review the answers that you picked. It still won't show you the correct answers, and you can jot them down. As soon as you click complete section, you lose the ability to do that, because it's going to show you the answer key. And then when you go back and review the section, it highlights the correct answer to every question. So it's shot. You've lost the ability to do blind review. So don't do that. Don't complete the section, but do document your answers before you click out, right? The whole point of this is that you should not look at the results or the correct answers immediately after your time section. Now, let me explain why I think that's crucial. It has to do with that active learning versus passive learning. If you know the correct answer, you shift your posture to a passive mode. You're trying to figure out what's good about the right answer, what's bad about the wrong answer, but it's passive because you already have the cue. You already know which answer to look for strengths. You already know which answer to look for the weaknesses. On the real test, you don't know whether you're supposed to be looking for the good things about the answer choice or the bad things. And so not knowing the correct answers allows you to continue to learn actively from that set of questions, to continue to problem solve your way through that set of questions. Eventually, we will look at the correct answers. Don't worry, you can satisfy your curiosity. You just have to put that on hold for a few hours so that you can engage in a blind review. And I think that this term has been used inconsistently in the market, and therefore there's some confusion about what we mean by a blind review. I mean something particular. I mean blind in the sense that you don't know the correct answers. And by review, I mean you are reviewing it. You're doing it a second time. It's not the first time you're looking at the section. So once you've completed the time section, then I think you should go through the entire section. And I literally mean every single question of the section, read it again, and choose an answer. Except this time, there's no time limit. So all of the anxiety and the pressure is off. I find the blind review to be tremendous fun. I think time testing is very stressful, and I make mistakes, and then I have to live with them. And there's, you know, all kinds of elements to time testing that are uncomfortable. But blind review is really about learning. It's about reading that stuff really carefully, thinking deeply about what it means. If you don't know the words, you pull up the dictionary and you learn them, and you brute force it. I mean, you literally understand all of the statements to the fullest the fullest extent possible. The other things that I want students to do during blind review is to document, meaning write down a pre-phrased answer for each question before they read the answer choices. This is about building verbal dexterity so that you can speak the language of the LSAT, not just choose or eliminate answers. And then finally, once you do, you know, you pre-phrase your answer, you look through the answer choices, and then you're going to have to make your decision. What's the correct answer? It'll either be the same or different as the answer that you chose on your time section. It doesn't really matter. I still want students to go through one extra step here. I want them to document their rationale for all of these answers that they're choosing. Why are you choosing the answer you're choosing? Why are you eliminating the answer that you're eliminating? And this is so important because you still don't know the right answer. And by writing this down, you're giving your tutor gold. You're giving the tutor some insight into your thinking process that he or she can never recapture once the correct answer is revealed to you. The other way to show this to your tutor is to do questions, naive questions with the tutor. But holy cow, that's an expensive way to learn, to, do them in real time. I prefer for my students to go do them on their own time, document their thinking, figure out where they made their mistakes, and then we can really pinpoint those particular errors that they made and inspect the logic carefully to see what went wrong and how we can improve it. So that's what blind review is all about. It's very tedious, but the time pressure is off, and the information that you mine during the blind review process is important for step 3. It's important to take that information to your tutor or to take that information into your step 3 studies to formulate a strategy that's going to help you get better. Not many people do a true blind review. Let me go back a second and explain why I think this is so important. Everybody reviews questions they get wrong. I don't know any person who studies the LSAT and doesn't review their mistakes. The genius of blind review is that it doesn't focus on your mistakes. When you blind review, you also go back and repeat and reinforce the strategies that enabled you to get questions correct. That's important. When you're only focusing on your errors, it's like whack-a-mole. You're constantly looking at different things that you did wrong. What are you going to do about those things that you're doing wrong? You also have to identify the things that you're doing well so that you can say, well, instead of doing that thing wrong, I'm going to substitute it for this other thing that is working really well on these other 6 questions. But you won't necessarily know what that is if you aren't engaging in a process of review and repetition of the questions that you get right. So blind review is a truly powerful study method if you're doing it correctly. The last step of triple review is the mind step, the metacognition step. And unfortunately, what some students have pointed out to me is that this is really 2 steps, not 1. So this is steps 3 and step 4. But quadruple review sounds stupid. So I'm keeping it as 3 steps, and maybe I'll add some kind of follow-up or something like that. Let's see, Annie asked, should you be looking at your timed answers while you're doing the blind review? I'd prefer you don't, but I don't think it's as harmful as the correct answer. But honestly, I'd prefer if you do the entire process again, rework the entire problem the right way without the biases that creep in because of the time limit. Use blind review as a way to say, what would I do? How would I approach this if there were no time limit? If I could literally, do anything I want, what would I do? Knowing that helps you to craft a good time strategy. You can say, well, that's the ideal. I don't have time for that, but I can borrow these things from that approach that are really helpful and incorporate those into my timed approach. So ideally, Annie, my answer would be no. I wouldn't even want my student to be looking at their original answers. I'd like to get a complete fresh slate. In fact, you can do that through LawHub by choosing Start New Test instead of Resume Test. You can take a test where you've already done a section timed. You go back to the library, click Start New Test, and it'll give you a fresh look up until a fresh exam with that same set of questions, but with no answers. So that's a really good question. Thank you, Annie. All right, step 3. At some point after your blind review, at that point, you've exhausted your own ability to figure out the questions. Now you have to look up the correct answers. And you're going to find that you miss certain questions timed, you miss certain questions blind. You want to compare them. Are you able to improve your performance? Did you get worse blind? I think there's a lot of valuable information in comparing. Was it the same set of questions that you missed both times, or were you tending to correct your wrong answers to right ones? The third review is now more your traditional reviewing your mistakes. I call this 2 steps, either cognitive development and strategic development. Cognitive development is about the questions that you missed. What is it that you screwed up? What do you need to learn to understand that question. And here we're finally getting to the question that you all asked me at the very beginning, was how do I use all of those resources? I think you don't until you get here. At this point, you have exhausted your own ability to understand the question. Even with unlimited time, you got it wrong. So the first thing I would do is I would look at an explanation for that question. What does Velocity Prep have to say in his videos? What do the Power Score forums say about that question? The Manhattan Prep forums, what are they saying about that question? Seven Sage has videos on many questions. Do they provide an explanation? If it seems like it's the question itself that I don't quite understand, that's when I might pull out the Power Score Bible and try to inform myself. How do strengthened questions work, or how do necessary assumption questions work? I wouldn't try to learn that lesson as just a rubric, like I'm just going to read the Bible and learn all the question types. I would try to learn a question type when I demonstrate that I don't get it because I'm missing it consistently. Then I use the metacognition step to say, okay, now's the time for me to go read a chapter or two about formal logic or conditional logic, or a chapter or two about assumptions, because I can see that that's a gap in my conceptual understanding of the exam. So I would consume the resources kind of like an encyclopedia, Wikipedia, as needed, not from beginning to end. And the other thing, that's also how I would use the tutor. I would never ask a tutor to do a question with me until I had completely exhausted my own ability to understand it and all of the free resources or all of the inexpensive resources on the market. And then if I still couldn't get it, then I would say, okay, now it makes sense to pull an expert in and say, what's your take on it? What am I missing? But otherwise, I think if you're asking a low-end tutor to just spoon feed you the lessons, then I think you're hoping to learn through passive learning, and we just find that that's not truly effective in the long run. The last thing that I have here for cognitive development, this is my favorite game. Every question that a student misses when they do tutoring with me, when they ask me, will you explain this question to me? The final thing that I do is I tell them, yes, I will tell you what's wrong with the answer you chose. I will tell you what's good or better about the correct answer. But then I want the student to convert his or her wrong answer into a right one. That's how they prove to me that they understand what the heck I'm talking about. And this game is a ton of fun. You have to rewrite the wrong answers. You have to identify which portion of it is wrong, strike it out, and then you have to rewrite it. And you can't rewrite the portions that were good. So it's not just a matter of saying, oh, well, this would be right if it were D instead of B. It has to be in the spirit of the wrong answer. If you chose it, there was probably something good about it, but then something went awry. So identifying what was good and what was bad, and having the verbal dexterity to manipulate the language, that's where I find you make a lot of your developments. Because ultimately, you're never going to see that question again. Here's the bottom line. Understanding that question is irrelevant. The key is, can you take home a lesson from that question that will enable you to get future questions correct? So what I like to ask myself is, if I chose an answer that was wrong, obviously it was hard for me to see what was bad about the answer choice. What I like to develop then is this affirmative language. What would the answer choice have to have said to have been right? Help me recognize how to identify right answers, not just criticize the wrong one. So that's the game or activity or exercise that I developed as part of the metacognition or mind step to help develop verbal dexterity. That's for the next question, not to understand just this one. All right, last but certainly not least is the strategic development, because none of that cognitive development matters if you can't translate it to the skills of the time test. So then the final thing I ask my students to do before they wrap up that particular section is to identify the one or two things that they screwed up the worst. What were the things that caused you to make the most mistakes or the biggest errors? and I don't want to overwhelm the learning process. What the psychologists tell us is we can only deal with about 7 chunks of new information, plus or minus 2. So if you read the entire PowerScore Bible, you've exceeded by far the number of chunks of new information that you can work with. And unless you are committing those to long-term memory, they're just exiting your brain as soon as you read, the next 7 chunks of pieces of information. So I really want my students to be targeted here. We're going to try to learn 1 thing or 2 at max. And we figure out what they are. And then using the strategy guides, using a tutor, using all the resources on the market, we develop a highly specific action plan. What are you going to do about that error that you made on your next time test? And these have to be very concrete. Here's how I phrase my action plan. When this trigger occurs, I will execute this concrete strategy, and you get to replace the trigger and the strategy. Knowing the right strategy is irrelevant if you don't know when to implement it. So the first thing we need to know is, what's the trigger? How do you know when you're starting to go down the wrong road? Are you bad at strengthen questions? The trigger is when I get to a strengthen question. Are you bad at interpreting answer choices? Then the trigger is when I get to the answer choices. You find the point of failure and you call it out. Then you have to find what is the concrete strategy that you want to employ to improve when you hit that trigger. And here I find that many people are wrong because they're negative. I'm not going to do this. Well, then you're focusing on the wrong strategy. You're continuing to think about what not to do. So I prefer to come up in advance with, well, what is the right thing to do? What is the strategy that you would prefer to execute at that stage? And we call it out, we name it. I want them to write it down. It's not just develop an action plan. I should have said document the action plan, because when they get to the next section, the next time they do a timed logic game section or timed LR or timed RC, whatever that one happens to be, I want them to have that action plan pinned right in front of them. They have to implement this. That's the only way to improve, to take the biggest errors and change the way that they start approaching the next test, because they're going to have to implement that action plan several times before it's fully ingrained in part of their strategy. Sometimes people talk about a wrong answer journal, and Jacob Feldman and I are skeptical about whether wrong answer journals are really helpful or not. But what we think would be very, very helpful is an action plan journal. If you kept track every single practice test, here's what I did wrong, and here's what I think would help me improve that. You could review that once a month or once every few weeks to make sure that you're continuing to implement effective strategies and to make sure that you're following a trajectory that's, getting better and better and improving. But I don't know what the point of just reviewing wrong answers would be. All right, I've got one more slide, but I'll let you guys jump in for questions if you'd like. Anybody? All right, well, let me wrap it up and then I'll pause the presentation and you guys can stick around or bail out. Even after I teach people about triple review, I find that oftentimes the response that I get is, I still don't know what the hell you want me to do, Keith. And I'm sympathetic. I've been teaching this for so many years that it's that damn curse of knowledge. It's clear to me, not to you. Here's what I suggest. First of all, try it before you tell me you don't get it. It's a lot. It's like shooting a basketball. I can't describe it enough times before you try it. Like eventually you're just gonna have to do it, and then we can start getting into the dynamics of it. So I've got a link here, which I'll share with you guys in the comments. I made some infographics that describe triple review for each of the 3 sections of the exam. Also, Jacob Feldman and I are developing a product based on Google Forms. These forms walk you through the blind review process. We don't quite have the 3rd review process created yet. In fact, we don't have any of these fully created yet. It's a totally beta product. We're not ready to sell it. If it's something you want to come beta test for us and check out, send me a private message and let's hook up, because I think these are really cool and I'd like to see what you think about them. The Google form, blind review. I don't even know what to call it. We'll come up with a name of it. Once you've tried triple review, figure out what's confusing you, and then come ask me. I do 3 pro bono sessions a week. So don't abandon triple review. I want to be a resource. I want to be available to help people understand this thing that I've created. And if the pro bono sessions are not giving you enough individual attention, I teach a series of inexpensive classes with Jacob Feldman. We have one starting in a couple weeks that covers the May 2020 Flex exam. And we'd love to have you come take that class. And if you can afford it and think it would be helpful to you, please consider hiring me for private tutoring.
I want to say that I started triple review probably at the beginning of this year. And whenever I'm utilizing it effectively, and that means making sure that I'm being really thorough for the third part of it, I typically find maybe a 1 to 2 point increase in my score as an overall trend. Like there's at least something that I learn. And right now with it, so my score is kind of plateauing, but it's my practice test scores, but it's a decent score. So I'm okay with the plateau, but I am finding now a consistency in the type of problems that I miss, which means that I'm able to really know what I need to work on. And so with triple review, it's for me at least, it's been the absolute most effective study method because it gives me consistency. I see measurable results, and I'm learning so much. But I don't know.
Well, I'm glad to hear it, Ashton. And there was something I wanted to ask you about it. What are your plateau? What are your last few practice test scores? Would you care to share?
Sure. 166, 167, 167.
All right, awesome. I just want to make sure you're trending in the right direction and in the range that I'm happy with, and that's perfect. So
And
good.
that's my time score, my untimed score, which I guess we care about the time score, but the untimed score, my last one was 177. So
Cool.
yeah.
I find that your time score goes up as your untimed score goes up. You never close the gap. I shouldn't say never. Some people are really good, but I think you will pretty much always be better untimed. But one of the ways to start improving on your time tests is to improve untimed, just to get the foundations necessary to answer some of the hardest questions. The analogy that I would give you is this. After I learned calculus, algebra seemed remarkably easy. If you can brute force your way through blind review through some of the most difficult questions and truly grasp them, it will make the simpler questions seem like cake. It's paradoxical. How does going slow make you faster? I don't know. I wish I understood the brain science. I'd really like to get a PhD in neuroscience and figure out how it works. But blind review is where most of the magic happens. It's like practicing scales. If you want to be a good jazz improviser, you better know those scales inside and out, by thirds, by fourths. You have to know the scale, all different kinds of ways. Same thing here. You have to develop those fundamentals, and then you can take the handcuffs off on the time test. I don't use every strategy all the time, but because I use so many strategies on blind review, I'm never at a loss for a way to think about a question. If I don't set it up one way, I'll set it up another way. It doesn't matter. I don't think about what's the best way because I have many different tools to reach for in my toolkit. And you don't develop those by just doing time tests. You develop those by thinking through these questions on a deeper level. All right, I've shared a couple links in the chat to, what are those? One is to the triple review infographics that we created. The other is to the course. And I'm going to stop the recording